Well, hello and welcome to Critical Wade Theory. And this is sort of a show within a show that I've been calling Reply To. Basically, I respond to YouTube comments that people post on my political leaning episodes. And this response is to at Duxdog, that's Duxdawg. And the video that this person originally commented on was episode 64 of my other podcast titled Mr. K is Wrong. And that episode was titled Who Owns the Earth? A Big Contradiction in MAGA Populism. So basically, this person, if you want to read their original comments, you could go to that video and remember, the podcast is titled Mr. K is Wrong, and Duck's Dog's comments are there for you to read. I'm not going to go over them myself because there are like 5 or 7 different comments, and they're, you know, just available for anybody who wants to see them. But here's my response to those, and I'm titling this episode Capitalism Needs the State, plus Private Property is State Power. So, Duck's Dog's response attempts to shift the debate using some classic ideological talking points, historical revisionism, and a false either or spectrum. I will attempt to dismantle their arguments directly using economics, history, and basic political science while tying it right back to my original theme of land, state power, and property, because that was really the crux of what I was getting at with my original arguments. Now, Duck's Dog does this true capitalism has never been tried. That's sort of like a cop out argument. And their claim is that the robber barons, weren't real capitalism because government was picking winners and losers. And the argument is true capitalism requires minimal government intervention, where the state's only role is breaking up monopolies and protecting domestic firms. So I do have a little bit of a rebuttal to that. Capitalism cannot exist without state power. Capitalists need the government. Who enforces contracts? Who maintains property deeds? Who sends armed police to clear out strikers or squatters? Capitalism doesn't exist in a state of nature. It is a system of rules maintained entirely by state force. And there's a bit of a monopoly paradox here. Free markets naturally trend toward consolidation. If a company wins at competition, it buys out its rivals, it scales up, and lowers prices beyond what smaller competitors can match, and forms a monopoly without necessarily having government help. Although, of course, they still often will have government help. In fact, with rare or possibly no exception. So the claim that government's only role is breaking up monopolies admits that the free market inherently creates monopolies that would require government intervention to fix the problem. So, what's the historical reality here? Well, the rail barons didn't just get subsidies, they relied on government land grants, the literal state seizure and redistribution of land connecting back to the enclosure acts that I commented on in the original video. And they rely on the government to create private wealth. So Duck's Dog also got into this absurd left versus right political spectrum thing. Now, I don't completely reject political labels because, well, for one thing, they help us understand just generally what we're talking about when we talk about large groups of people or specific groups of people. And, labels can be useful, but they can also be a little distractive. They can also be incorrect or inaccurate and all sorts of things. So, the claim here that this YouTube comment made is that left equals government control, tyranny, genocide, and right equals personal freedom, liberty, and mutual benefit. They dump fascism, monarchism, Islam, and oligarchy into the left bucket. So I've got a little bit to say about that. Redefining political science is, a bit of a folly. No serious political scientist, historian, or economist defines the spectrum that way. Flattening all history into government equals left and no government equals right is a political gimmick designed to make one's own side definitionally incapable of evil. Sorry, I'm struggling with my words here all of a sudden. But I just have to say this: fascism is quite explicitly right wing. Fascism, like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, was violently anti communist and anti socialist. And Hitler privatized state industries on a massive scale, banned trade unions, and forged direct alliances with wealthy industrial capitalists like Krupp, Tyson, and Porsche. And that matters. So calling fascism left wing ignores actual history. Now, the fascist movement did borrow some rhetoric and propaganda techniques from the communists because they saw that it was an effective uh, way to propagandize the public. But aside from that, the only common denominator was authoritarianism. And of course, that these authoritarian systems, they took away human freedom and they left a lot of people dead. But to say that there were no different ideologies at play is a little bit misleading because Nazi Germany was quite explicitly anti communist, anti Marxist, and all of that. Even though, yes, you could say that there were similarities because of the authoritarian tendencies, nevertheless, the fascists themselves would have told you that they were substantially different from the other authoritarian tendency. So let's consider monarchism and feudalism and their right wing origins. The terms left and right originated in the French Revolution. Those who sat on the right supported the absolute monarchy, traditional hierarchy, and elite privilege. Those on the left wanted democracy and egalitarianism, or something like that. So claiming the right stands for individual liberty against the king reverses the origin of the political spectrum, the very terms left and right. So keep that in mind when it comes to these false dichotomies that some of these people will present when it comes to political debates. History matters. The very terms left and right do have they have historical roots, and it pays to keep that in mind sometimes. So, what about the myth of right wing freedom and all that? So, their claim is that under the liberty of the right, everything is mutually beneficial. We, the people, control our own choices and all that kind of stuff. The problem is, private tyranny is still tyranny. Authoritarian control doesn't only come from bureaucrats, it also comes from unchecked private power. If a corporation owns the water supply, the housing stock, or the local land, as seen in company towns during the industrial era, I said area instead of era. Let me try that again. If a corporation owns the water supply, the housing stock, or the local land, as seen in the company towns of the industrial era, you are not actually all that free. You submit to a private tyrant or you starve. So it also pays to note that, yes, these private tyrannies do enjoy some support from the government. And in fact, even if you didn't have a government, these private entities would form a government to protect their interests and their profits. That just sort of as a matter of common sense, because you don't end up in a privileged position and then say, you know what, I'm not going to defend this privilege. I'm just going to relent and let everybody take over what I've accumulated. That's not how things tend to work if you're talking about systems of privilege and power, which is actually what money is and what money is intended to function like. So let's also consider right wing authoritarianism. Modern right wing policies heavily rely on government control, such as banning books, using state power to restrict civil rights, deploying state police against protesters, using eminent domain for border walls, and restricting reproductive rights. So the right does not equal less government. It equals government power used to enforce traditional hierarchies and protect capital. And of course, it will also create some new hierarchies where previous ones might not have even existed. Because when it comes to the divide and conquer game that is so common in authoritarian circles, if they're not going after one group, they will tend to go after another, because if you keep the population divided, they are actually easier to manipulate and to control and conquer and all that kind of stuff. So, uh, Duck's Dog also created some weapon or brought up some weaponized quotes from Winston Churchill and Ayn Rand. So, the Winston Churchill quote: ironically, Churchill himself was a high Tory imperialist who used state power aggressively, including sending government troops against British striking miners and overseeing state managed colonial economies and severe famines like in Bengal. And he believed in a heavy state apparatus when it benefited British imperial interests. So the quote that was given, it is almost irrelevant, because Winston Churchill did indeed represent British imperial interests. And as for the Ayn Rand quote, Rand famously claimed that taxation is theft and state assistance is slavery. Yet in her final years, Rand actually lived off Social Security and Medicare under her married name, under the name of Anne O'Connor. Even the most radical anti state capitalist icons rely on the public safety nets built by the collective society when push comes to shove. So even when it comes to that sort of thing, you know, the reality is often different from what these right wingers will tell you it is. And that's also true of Elon Musk, coincidentally. You know, he's considered the first trillionaire or whatever, but he also has relied on taxpayer subsidies for his businesses. So you can kind of put that in your pipe and smoke it. As far as defining capitalism as pure magic that creates freedom and blaming the left for every bad thing government or corporations have ever done, that isn't political philosophy, it's fairy tale thinking. Capitalism requires the state to enforce property titles, to hand over land, and to bail out private industry when it crashes. You cannot credit capitalism for the wealth while blaming government for the framework that made that wealth possible. It just doesn't make sense. So anyway, I do want to thank this Duck's Dog guy or girl for making these comments, and at least I can say I don't believe this was a bot, and I had fun kind of debunking these arguments, and yeah, I think some of these people who make these comments, I don't really know if they're that familiar with the actual history of the global capitalist system, or how a lot of these ideas actually have origins in things like monarchies. So calling them libertarian is actually a little bit silly when the very premise involves the state actually having a lot of say in how life happens. You know, they're not really libertarian arguments. And also, obviously, it needs to be said, and it's not said often enough. But things like money are actually, even though they're often presented as opportunities and as freedom, they're also actually systems intended to restrict. So keep that in mind. Like, if you don't have wealth in a capitalist society, if you have like $0, what do you have? You have nothing. And if there is no sort of safety net, well, then you might have less than nothing because the system will only punish you further for your lack of wealth. So it could be about as bad as any system of slavery that has ever existed in human history, in a very real way. If you just don't have any sort of resources, no one there to help you, if you're discriminated against, and if you just have an unfortunate set of circumstances where you're not able to work or anything like that, what do you do? Well, you can probably just die, I guess. So that's why we have a complex or mixed system rather than just pure capitalism or whatever, because that would actually be a nightmare scenario for a lot of people. All right, that's it for this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to like and subscribe. Leave comments for me to reply to in the future. And I failed to see where you would uh, say I was incorrect on any of these arguments, but feel free. I know that even if I'm right, some people out there will say that I am dead wrong. So, anyway, have a good one.